Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so glad you've joined me this evening for the second part of our story. If you haven't heard part 1, click on the description because you don't want to miss out on the entire story. And let's continue with part 2 of our story. We were picked up in Nashville by a friendly driver who could barely speak a word of English. I'm not exactly sure where he was from, but he did look foreign. When he said, "Welcome to Nashville," it sounded as if he was saying, "Welcome to Mashville." If there were any pluses to having a driver who could only speak pidgin English, he seemed like a competent driver, which was probably why he'd been given the job in the first place. He steadily managed negotiating the dips, cracks and crevices and high mountain elevations in the road with a proficient mastery that was nothing short of impressive, as some of those sheer mountain passes would have left me shaking in my boots like a quivering wreck. The minibus ferried me, my best friend, and 5 other art students who, like myself, were from Los Angeles, from Nashville to the homestead tucked away in the mountains. There are no words I can find to possibly describe how magnificent the Appalachian Mountains actually were at this prepossessing time of year. All you could hear in the van were the guttural gasps and whoops of joy as people cried out, "It's breathtaking! It's absolutely breathtaking!" And it sure was. The subtle, benignant and mellow lighting of the sun was flattering. Its gossamer radiance washed over the landscape in a golden glaze, as if everything had been sprinkled in a magical gold dust. The rich autumn colours of late September were gloriously inspirational. The deferential mountains themselves left their indelible, assertive, voluptuous footprints on the horizon, mischievously peeking through a mysterious white foggy curtain of mist that made them appear all the more mystical, magical and enchanting. The trees, so many of them, ubiquitous in their number, from the maples, the hobble bushes, the pin cherries, the yellow birches, the American beeches, boasted branches ablaze with resplendent leaves in golds, reds, russets, yellows and ambers. Their untamed, fiery, dramatic colours were meant for oils on canvas, and I could not wait to get this rich, vibrant colour onto my paintbrush and get busying myself with transferring the natural world to my canvas. Soon before we entered a long, narrow gap in the trees, we could see a rather rusty sign that read Blueberry Bracken Manor. The driver turned around to us and said, which was probably meant to be, "We are here. We've arrived at our destination. Get ready to disembark." But instead he said, "We've arrived at our destination. Get ready to disembark." The mini-van carefully weaved its way through the long tunnel of trees, over the ruggedly rocky terrain, towards a series of outbuildings on a hilly elevation, and nestled at the top of the hill was a stone and wood ranch-type dwelling that looked like it could generously accommodate an extensive, very sizable family. It was so large, which explained why it was capable of housing 7 art students for the entire week. The house, with its large windows and mini patios, seemed to smile at us as we stared at it in awe, and the first thought that sailed into my head was, "I'm so glad I came." I was to learn later that my best friend Nancy had felt the same sense of congenial welcome warmth from the house, as places can definitely give off their own energy signatures, and this unassuming, wholesome stone house seemed to unabashedly reach out and hug us, and indeed if it had physically owned arms, it would probably have done just that. The stone and wood blended in seamlessly with the picturesque countryside, and looked as if it had stood there for many generations, like the mature-looking trees on the right-hand side of the property that stretched out into a generous-sized wood-grove, teeming with natural wildlife and spectacular birds, some so colourful, the likes that I've never seen before. Well, not in Los Angeles, that is. But it was a curiously speckled-looking bird that won over my heart during our trip, and all these years later I have no idea what it was. After madly surfing through so many bird books, I am still none the wiser. It was a married couple called Jack and Blanche Beveridge that owned Blueberry Bracken homestead, where they grew their own vegetables and were completely self-sufficient. They owned Black and Bay American quarter horses and dappled horses. I'm not sure what breed those were. Cows, chickens, and a huge pot-belly pig called Bertie, who the family adored. And he happily ate all the leftovers, and believe me, that was one of the most contented pigs I've ever met in my entire life. But with Blanche's irresistibly delicious food, who could blame the thing for being deliriously happy? If I had to come back in another lifetime, I'd happily settle for being Blanche's pot-belly pig. And the big advantage is I could eat to my heart's content, knowing that the bigger I got, the more magnificent I would become. Let's just say Bertie probably lived on a gluttonous diet of apple pie and oat and raisin cookies, and goodness knows what else. The farmhouse possessed spectacular views over the mountains and extensive congregations of trees. The farmer's wife, Blanche, was like a domestic goddess who canned, cured, and dry-freezed all her produce, and her huge pantry took my breath away quite literally. I've never seen anything like it before or since. There were bottles of preserves, fruits, chutneys, pulses, pickles, you name it, and she had it all. She made her own butter and delicious cheeses. Oh my goodness, that woman could cook, and efficiency was her middle name. She was plump but a handsome woman, with a well-rounded face, dark hair that she wore away from her face in a French braid, and bright brown, bear-like eyes. She wore a pinafore and an apron, and was always standing in the kitchen with a rolling pin in her hands, the quintessential archetype of a thoroughbred cook, in every sense of the word, if you ask me. Blueberry Bracken unapologetically smelt of baked goods all the time. You could smell cinnamon buns, baked bread, melted cheese, and butter intermingled with fragrant spices that would waft in the air and drive your taste buds completely bananas. And if you thought you weren't hungry, the taunting smell would make you believe that you unquestionably were. By all accounts, the most well-disciplined people left the art retreat at least 10 pounds heavier, as no one could exercise moderation with the irresistible, delectable food that was presented to us at mealtimes, that would mercilessly hijack the willpower of the most hardened dieter. It was that tempting. There was something magical about the fresh, crisp mountain air that could awaken a reticent, subdued appetite, stirring it up like the spell in a witch's cauldron, so that you would suddenly become outrageously hungry, and all good intentions would indiscriminately be abandoned to the wayside. Ostensibly Nancy, who tended to be indifferent towards food at the best of times, was eating like a horse, and forgetting that she was only 5'3". She was struggling to close the top buttons on her jeans, which was a first. I'll never forget her mortified reaction when she had to lie back on her bed and tried desperately to pull up her zipper, as she squeezed her tummy in as tightly as she possibly could, because that zipper was not going up easily, without putting up quite a fight. Once she finally got the zipper up, she was aimlessly dancing around the room, wrestling with a button that refused to sink into its buttonhole, without really stretching the fabric, but thankfully her jeans had some give. "Oh my God!" said Nancy, contorting her face in disgust. "What the hell is happening to me? I'm blowing up like a balloon!" In horror, she ran to the bathroom scales to weigh herself in a moment of brazen courage. I was not willing to face the scales myself. I was terribly afraid of what the numbers would convey, as like a foreboding truth serum. Those numbers were never kind to me at the very best of times, and especially not after my recent overindulgences. I could feel my own waistband on my pants was significantly tightening, but I never told Nancy this. I was always wrestling with those last 10 pounds of weight, and after my visit to Blueberry Bracken, I knew unequivocally I'd be rolling home like a sumo wrestler, but hopefully without the nappy, unless I couldn't fit into my clothes anymore, which was a very real possibility, the way things were beginning to look. Nancy's eyes were as wide as saucers. "You're not going to believe it," she told me, as she evacuated herself from the bathroom. Her face had grown as white as a sheet. "What?" I said, jumping up on my bed. "You're scaring me, Nancy. What on earth is wrong?
"Oh my God, you're not pregnant, are you?" "Oh no, it's far worse than that, much worse than that. I've just been on the scale 10 times. I'm sorry, there must be something very wrong with it. Maybe on the flight it got slightly damaged. I've only gone and put on 11 pounds in weight. And the dial, it's very close to 12. How is that possible?" she asked incredulously, staring at me as if she thought I was entirely responsible for this miraculous increase in her body size. "Don't look at me, Nancy," I said. "You're the one that's been doing all the eating. I will remind you I told you that you ate 3 cinnamon buns and a large piece of apple pie for breakfast yesterday, with several dollops of cream, and that was just for breakfast. Need I go on and remind you of what else you ate? Because let's just say it wasn't exactly a little." "Are you sure I ate that much?" she asked me. "I'm sure," I told her. "My God! If I get any fatter, I won't even get my legs into these jeans anymore. But I might remind you, Amelia, you were the one that insisted I tasted that apple pie. So this is all your fault, and I hold you accountable." "That's true," I confessed, "but I didn't tell you to eat a piece the size of a dinner plate, did I?" Nancy made a contorted face. "Why does that woman have to be such a damn good cook? I'm glad I'm not her daughter. I can't imagine how big I would be if I lived with her full time. Did you see her daughter at the dinner table? She's 15 years old and as skinny as a rake. How can she be so skinny with all that delicious food around? It beats me." Well, to be fair, I noticed that Blanche's daughter was just eating watermelon and yogurt for breakfast, not eating the amounts of food you were. "Are you saying I'm a pig? Is that what you're saying?" "I'm not saying anything, Nancy," I said, throwing my arms up in the air in exasperation. There were 7 students on the course, and the farmer's wife kept our rooms and the homestead in perfect order, and in the evenings there would be a huge, sumptuously romantic crackling fire in the living room, where we'd eat our dinner at a large oakwood table, where we were served food that still makes me salivate today, just thinking about it. Blanche procured all kinds of wickedly delicious and very hearty southern fare, and her homemade bread, well, it was certainly the cherry on the cake, that was for sure. In my opinion, nothing beats homemade bread. Our art teacher was a man called Philip. I can't remember his surname, but I think it was something like Doherty. Regretfully, he is now deceased. He was quite an eccentric man, with a strong Irish accent, and he dressed like an English gentleman, with a tweed jacket, caramel-coloured chinos, a white shirt, and a very smart-looking cravat. I never ever saw him dress in anything casual, and it was a profound mystery to me that he never got any paint on any of his clothes or fingers. But when he painted, he doggedly ploughed into those paints with an ardent, zestful enthusiasm. He could produce a masterpiece in a single sitting, without even batting an eyelid. I mean, how did he do that? Like any skilled master, he made painting look like a walk in the park, or a cool breeze on a hot summer's day, while the rest of us pottered along with our creations, sometimes wrestling with our paintbrushes in abject frustration. Philip had long old-fashioned sideburns, and buoyantly curly brown hair. He had bushy eyebrows, a long face, and very pale blue eyes. He was nonconformist and quite old-fashioned in every regard. He would not have looked out of place on the cast of Downton Abbey, as he had that debonair, dapper look about him, but he would lightly play the role of a very posh mad poet. I noticed he always wore bright red socks, which I found curiously interesting. The man had a natural flair for art, and he could paint still lifes, landscapes, and contemporary art with an effortless ease, in every medium, from watercolours to acrylics. But Philip said he loved oils on canvas best of all, because of the rich colours. It turned out he was an excellent teacher. I learnt a lot on this retreat, more than I've ever done before in any art class in Los Angeles, and I say that unabashedly. We were taken to the town to visit quirky little shops and restaurants that, much like Philip, appeared nonconformist. We were taken to visit scenic vistas where we could paint the colourful autumn landscape under Philip's expert guidance and informative instruction. I could see that my work was improving in leaps and bounds, and Philip told me as much. And let me tell you, That man did not give compliments very lightly. I had never met anyone like Philip before. God almost certainly broke the mould when he made him. Let's just say he had an individualistic, romantically eccentric personality, and spoke all about the Irish legends and tales, and all these curiously intriguing stories about the Fae. I would privately laugh and say to myself, nobody believes that, right? But I promise you, some of the pupils held on to his every word, as if it was the gospel truth. He turned around to me when he saw me scoffing and said, "Be careful what you laugh at, young lady. Don't think I didn't see you roll your eyes back then and snigger. I warn you, the universe has a funny way of calling you out if you're a cynic. Something will happen to you if you doubt so much, and it might not be terribly good. So you've been duly warned. As my old grandmother used to say, words are like bullets. They can go off and cause chaos if they're fired in the wrong company. So watch your words, guard your thoughts. I think there's a passage in the Bible that says, watch your tongue, keep your mouth shut, and you will stay out of trouble. I assure you, this is not idle advice. I can tell you a story about what happened to my grandfather in Ireland in that regard, and it's a true story. One day when the family were gathered around the dinner table, one of the dinner guests was talking about the Fae, and my grandfather Thomas, that's what his name was, who was 18 at the time, bellowed with laughter. His face went a beetroot red colour. Tears went flying down his cheeks, he was laughing so much. He was drinking a beer at the time, and was waving it around in his arms above his head, in an objectionable drunken stupor, so some of the foamy discharge was spilling over the sides of his beer glass. He said, "You really think I'm going to believe this baloney? Do I look like I'm a simpleton who's got my head in the clouds? There are no such thing as the Fae. It's just a wild legend that has no bearing on the truth whatsoever. I cannot believe you people believing in all this airy-fairy stuff and nonsense." I gather all the guests around the dinner table went as white as a sheet, and one of the elderly guests said, "I hope nothing bad will happen to you, Master Thomas. I think the Fae will take offence at you laughing at them. They might seek revenge to teach you a lesson." At that my grandfather guffawed all the more. He had stitches in his stomach and almost split his sides from laughing so much. "Ooh," he said sarcastically, "I'm really scared. The little people are going to get me. They're going to get me, and I'm so frightened. Look at me. My heart is beating very fast. Oh, my God, what am I going to do? Please help me," he said, exaggerating the expression of angst on his face. Well, no one expressed any amusement over that dinner table, nor did they utter a single word, but they stared at my grandfather very soberly, as if he was an ignorant, silly little boy, lighting a match that might just shoot up in flames. That night the family returned to bed, feeling somewhat unsettled about my grandfather's rude outbursts about the Fae. They sensed something bad was about to happen, and their worst fears were confirmed. The following morning my grandfather could not be found, but one thing they discovered was a tiny blue hat that would fit the head of a 2-inch doe, lying among his bed sheets, that were totally cold to the touch. Everyone was nonplussed by this very extraordinary discovery, and believed that the little hat had been left in my grandfather's bed to tell us that the Fae were dealing with him for making fun of them. A search was conducted for my grandfather, and for 2 whole months he was never found. Then on one autumn day he returned home, as if nothing had happened. Everyone told him they'd been looking for him. Where had he been? He said he hadn't been anywhere, that he'd just returned from a casual stroll in the woods. He was informed he'd been gone for 2 whole months, but he had absolutely no memory or recollection of where he'd been. The people in the town wanted to show him the blue hat that had been found in his bed on that inauspicious morning when he had enigmatically vanished, but even the hat was gone. Several weeks later, when everyone was gathered around the dinner table, many were drinking, but my grandfather was not. Someone happened to be talking about the Fae, and when my grandfather was asked if he believed in the Fae, he went very quiet and said, "Of course I do. Shh, they might be listening." It would seem even though he had no memory of what had happened to him, he had it seared in his mind that the Fae were real, and he never ever made fun of them again. My grandfather believed the Fae had touched his intuition. The little blue hat was never recovered, but then on the anniversary of his abduction, for 2 years following, my grandfather would find a miniature daisy chain on the pillow of his bed, and he believes that these chains were from the Fae, to remind him, "We are real! Don't make fun of us again!" It would seem that whatever happened in those enigmatic 2 months when he vanished from our world, he had clearly won the Fae around. But from thenceforth, in the years that were to follow, you would never ever get my grandfather saying, "That's not possible." His attitude to the world shifted exponentially. He saw life through a different paradigm, or lens if you like. He would say to me, "Son, don't you ever forget it. But in this world of ours, there are many portals, many dimensions, many galaxies that lead to different worlds and different existences and different species of beings, and anything that you can dream of in your imagination is likely possible." It was ironic his first name was Thomas, as it seems the saying Doubting Thomas very much applied to him, and he was well and truly humbled. The strangest thing of all is the night before he died. He was 86 years old at the time. He told us when he went to bed that night that he loved us and that we would never ever get to see him again. Everyone laughed at him. They thought he was rambling about nothing and said to him, "Don't be ridiculous, Thomas. You're in vigorous good health. Why would you say a strange thing like that?" He got quite short with everyone and said, "I'm telling you the truth. In the morning I will be gone, and I'm not coming back." Get this, when we went to my grandfather's bedroom the following morning, he was deceased. Of course we did not know that at first. He looked so at peace lying on his bed. He had died with a smile on his face. His skin was not a waxy or grey colour, but was flushed pink. But his body was as cold as ice when we touched him, and very stiff. For a moment we thought he was alive, but he was definitely a goner. But there was a pretty daisy chain on his torso, along with a tiny blue velvet hat that had made its reappearance again after all these long years. 3 days after the funeral, the blue hat vanished again, and it was removed from a locked glass cabinet. I ask you, how could anybody move it without breaking the glass first? But that rarely did happen. Everyone who was painting had stopped what they were doing. They were listening intently to Philip's every word as he spoke about the Fae. And one artist said, "But did he really go missing, Philip? For 2 whole months? Your grandfather, I mean. Is there any documented evidence about that?" "There's no question he was gone for 2 months," said Philip emphatically. "He vanished into thin air. He was even registered by the police as a missing person. I searched the records myself when I was older to satisfy my obvious curiosity regarding the matter. Searches were conducted for him everywhere. Hundreds of people looked for him. No one found him, and he never turned up. The Fae are known for abducting people, usually much younger people than my grandfather at the time, when he was only 18. They're also known for taking babies from time to time. especially babies that have been brushed with something unusual, like being born with one brown eye and one blue eye. It's known as being touched.
But he did turn up in the end, didn't he? And I think that when he died, the Fae told him he was going to die, said one of the pupils, a girl called Ala. I mean, after all those years, they discovered the tiny blue hat on his bed, along with a daisy chain. That's so bizarre. And then the tiny hat disappears all over again. While I will admit I thought the story was incredible, I still clandestinely believed it had to be made up. But little did I know, something would invariably happen on this outlandish painting retreat that would make me cross-examine everything I thought I knew about our world, and surreptitiously reflect that maybe Philip was indeed right. The universe was paying me back in kind for being so arrogantly cynical, so blatantly presumptuous, and beyond anything else, insultingly belittling in regards to everybody else's beliefs. And I was possibly causing offence to the Fae. In truth, an apt description of me, if I'm being brazenly blunt about it, was I was behaving just like Philip's old grandfather before he was abducted by the Fae and went missing. A quintessential doubting Thomas, you could say. And look how badly that ended up for him. He went missing for over 2 months, and he ended up with egg all over his face, and that's a mild way of putting it. Then again, can you really blame me? Some things are hard to believe, hard to get your head around, and almost impossible to digest. And besides, isn't it healthy to embrace a wee bit of skepticism in our lives, and not swallow everything up we're told? It's called being discerning, isn't it? That night, as me and my best friend Nancy retired to our conjoined bedroom that we shared together, after having eaten a delicious sizable dinner, Nancy had assured me before we even went downstairs for that evening meal that she was only going to eat salad, and that I should snatch any food away from her if she dared put anything with calories on her plate. She made me promise to give her a hard time, but it was easier said than done. Suffice to say, as soon as a great big steamy golden-crusted chicken and ham pie arrived promptly at the dinner table, exuding a savoury aroma that would make the stiffest of resolves melt like butter, I could see that the battle had been lost. Nancy's eyes grew wide with delight. She looked at me contemptuously and growled. "Don't say anything," she told me, ladling out for herself an enormous portion of pie, and opting for second and third helpings later on. "What is all this about?" asked Blanche, her eyes studying me curiously. "Oh, nothing," Nancy had said defiantly. "It's just Amelia over here. She's got her knickers in a twist over something ridiculous. She won't stop nagging me. You know how it is." Blanche looked rather confused. Her expression said that she didn't know how it was, but she politely did not say a thing. I raised a brow at my friend, with a told-you-so look on my face, but Nancy wantingly ignored me. Then she finally looked at me with glaring eyes and said, all right, Amelia. I'm starting my diet tomorrow. Happy now?" Blanche looked appalled. "A diet?" she said, as if it was a foreign language. "What's wrong with you girls from Los Angeles, all worrying so much about your weight? It's the influences of Hollywood, if you ask me. So ridiculous. Should you not live and let be? Enjoy life's rich bounty?" "It's just Mrs. Beveridge," I tried to explain. "My friend Nancy here is struggling to fit into her jeans." Blanche viewed me through a withering gaze. "That's very simple, dear. It's not complicated. You just buy a larger size, don't you?" I hasten to say that the promised diet never made its appearance on that trip. Nancy's resolve was weak at the knees when it came to Blanche's delicious food. So back in the confines of our bedroom, I asked Nancy what she thought about Philip and his stories about the Fae. "Don't you think it's over the top?" I said. "I'm sorry, but how is one expected to believe in all this stuff and nonsense about the Fae? They're surely just legends." My friend shrugged her shoulders. "This coming from the girl at 7 years old that was so terrified of a monster that she believed was real in her dreams," she reminded me. Nancy had known me since I had been very young, since I was 7 years old, and all the night terrors I had experienced. "That's different," I said.
I was a naive callow kid back then, with a vivid imagination, wasn't I? But I've grown up now, and I don't believe in stuff like that anymore. You know what your problem is, Amelia? You're so doubting, aren't you? A real doubting Thomas you are. After the story Philip told us today about his grandfather going missing for 2 months, and the tiny little blue hat found on his bed, after he was missing, and after he was dead, I'd be extremely reluctant if I were you to say I don't believe. You know, there is a saying that there are more things on heaven and earth. My father used to tell me that all the time. I think it would be exceedingly arrogant of you to assume we know it all. And you know what? If we did, it would be a hell of a boring world. I guess if this was all there was, I would be a tad disappointed. More than a tad, actually. Think about it for a moment. Mystery makes the world far more alluring, interesting, exciting. I, for one, am exceedingly glad I don't know it all. But denying the possibility of the fae's existence suggests you think you do know it all. And you know what? That is presumptuously arrogant. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be unkind, but it is what it is. And let's face it, the way Philip was looking at you today, when you began scoffing about the fae, he was thinking the same that I'm thinking. I know he was. Do you have any idea how rude you were when you started snorting at his story? I looked aghast. I wasn't snorting, was I? You absolutely were. And do you know what? I actually felt sorry for you. Sorry for being so closed-minded. You think you're so clever, don't you, Amelia? You rarely do. But people who think they're so clever, they're usually not. That's what my good father used to tell me. It's foolish people who think they know so much, and wise people who admit that they know so little. That's what Tesla said, I believe. And he's right on the money about that, is he not? I get where you're coming from, I said, climbing into my bed in my pyjamas. But I'm not buying into all this stuff. I'm sorry, I'm not. Yes, I think Philip is a lovely Irish gentleman, very eccentric, and his stories are incredibly entertaining. And I'm having an amazing time on this trip here in the Appalachian Mountains. But everyone on this trip, apart from me, is lapping up his story like a cat with the milk. But I'm not that gullible. I guess you could say I'm a perennial cynic, and I have to challenge everything. It's just who I am. I'm just a questioner. I think you're unreasonable calling me arrogant like that. Rather you than me, said Nancy, pulling the duvet over her head. I'm sorry, but I don't want to behave like a puffed-up doubting Thomas and end up vanishing for 2 months, like Philip's grandfather did. And worse still, not remembering where the hell I've been. I couldn't think of anything worse than that. That would be very creepy, very airy. It had been an exhausting day. Philip had taken all 7 of us art students to a beautiful waterfall, which we had spent most of the afternoon painting with oils on canvas, and my rich painting was looking very eye-catching indeed. I was in total awe with myself for capturing the waterfall so superbly. I couldn't believe I'd actually done this myself. I was absolutely exhausted, as spending creative energy can be more exhausting than taking a long trek up the mountain, because creativity eats up energy like a worm in an apple. Most of our energy is burnt by our brains, and when you're painting you apply thought with your work, like oils to a canvas. Luckily in the morning it was a free day for us to do what we liked, and I had in mind to do a wee bit of shopping in the local town with Nancy, and maybe going for a walk a little later in the afternoon. The moment our heads hit the pillow, we were fast asleep, and these days I was sleeping like a baby, as the intrusive nightmares I engaged in as a 7-year-old kid were all but a blur in the past, a long distant memory. So there we are, that's the end of part 2. I look forward to you joining me tomorrow night for part 3 of our story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.